Everybody knows that the best shield ever is the one belonging to the culture that happens to be your favorite. Ah yes, good old bias, coloring everything we say and look at and think about. It's unavoidable, but we can at least try to explore the topic and think about some potential answers or at least ways of approaching this question, right? So the easiest way would be to go with an evolutionary approach, right? What's the best, whatever is the height of development. Unfortunately, that doesn't work that way. By that logic, the targe would be the ultimate best shield because it's the most recent well-known type of shield that was used for quite a long time, even when in other places shields had been discarded. So if in an age of guns, this shield can prevail, it must be the best, right? Well, I don't think that too many people in earlier time periods would have been incredibly impressed by it. They would have been like, yeah, it's all right, but could be larger. Then there's the question of whether you think the most versatile design is better or min-maxing is better. A good example of min-maxing is a puny little buckler like this compared to the Roman Scutum. This obviously maximizes speed and maneuverability and ease of carry at the expense of protectiveness, which is not a whole lot. Well, the Scutum does the exact opposite. It maximizes protectiveness at the expense of being very heavy and unwieldy compared to a smaller shield. Speaking of the Romans, that will be another way to approach it. Which shields have been used by the most effective militaries in history? Of course, the Romans come to mind, but so do the Greeks and the Macedonians. And they had very different shields. The Greeks used an Argive shield, which is round, reinforced with bronze, has this Argive grip in the center that the arm goes through, and then you hold onto a rope basically that goes around the rim of the shield. Those are extremely protective, large and sturdy, but also quite heavy. There's an argument to be made that you could possibly rest the rim on your shoulder because it is concave and the way it's designed looks like you could do that. Either way, there are definitely pros and cons, but the major drawback is it's somewhat clunky, which of course in a formation on the battlefield is not as big of a problem. We'll get back to that topic. The interesting thing is that as far as I know, the Romans derived their scutum from Celtic shields. So the Celts had large oval shields, and interestingly, around like in the late Roman Republic and then with the fall of the Roman Empire and beyond, you had the same sort of idea, oval shields. So they went from one to the other and then back to the original, sort of. They're not quite identical, but that's the general trend. So what's better now, curved rectangular or flat oval? Who knows? There are some observations that can be made about these types of shields. But if you simply go by succession, who was defeated by whom and which empire was replaced or fell, or like all empires fell. It's just a matter of time. You can't really say, oh, well, if only they had better shields, they would have survived. No, there's so many things that go into this. And this is where people are way too reductionist quite often. They focus on, okay, what armor did they have? What weapon did they have? What shield did they have? Do you really think that if the Romans had used the Greek-style Argive shield, they would have never been this successful? I don't think so. That's not the only thing. If you had given the Romans this type of shield, I'm pretty sure they would have been fine, right? Or if they had had Celtic shields. So I want to focus mainly on two primary types, which is a center grip shield and a strapped shield. Now I finally have both, thanks to Vaughn, who made this really cool shield. So my possibly controversial suggestion would be that this type of shield is more for dueling and smaller scale melees. If we think about the Vikings, obviously there were larger field battles during the Viking period, of course. But if you think about what Vikings as such, rather than simply Viking Age Scandinavians, so actual raiders What they were all about was, small scale engagements. So really just attack a village or a monastery or whatever, just quickly strike and move on. Hit and run, this is more, individual fighters engaging and again, smaller groups clashing, things of that nature, which is a very different dynamic from fighting in a well-coordinated, fairly tight formation. Now, Vikings did have formations. Before you think that this is some kind of Hollywood nonsense where they just charged loosely and then everything broke up into individual duels, there's like a sliding scale of more focused on individual warriors versus more focused on unit cohesion. But they had shield walls, right? Maybe. Some doubt has been cast on that idea. In particular, Rolf Worming, archaeologist and director of the Society for Combat Archaeology, is skeptical of the shield wall. Sources mention shield walls, but don't actually describe them in detail, like don't describe them as a formation, what they look like, etc. And he thinks that maybe shield wall was simply a poetic term for a group of warriors rather than a specific formation or tactic, which does make sense to me. Like, we can't really prove it conclusively one way or another. But if you look at skaldic poetry, kenningar in particular, which are a way of describing something in a metaphorical way. For example, in skaldic poetry, the kenning shaker of shields or angry shaker of shining hilts could mean a warrior. Now, that doesn't describe the way of fighting. Like, the kenning didn't mean that a warrior would just shake their shield and weapon. Another kenning for warrior is diminisher of the shield wall. Now, this is interesting because it can be interpreted in different ways. You can interpret it as, oh yeah, they're going up against the shield wall, as in the tactic, the formation that we often imagine. But it could also mean shield wall as in simply a group of warriors who have shields that you're going up against. So as a warrior, you are the diminisher of other warriors. And really any shield-bearing formation can look like a shield wall, whether or not the shields overlap. Even if they just stand there with the shields in front of them, it's a shield wall, right? It looks kind of like a wall, whether or not it's done in a static defensive position. There is a particular formation that we do know that is well described, the Svinfylking, which is the boar's formation. And that is an aggressive wedge formation, which is pretty much as close as you can get to the opposite of a static defensive shield wall. You're just going all in. If we look at surviving shields or shield fragments from the Viking period, and even test reconstructions, we see that they are not the most durable thing in the world. And in fact, the sagas very often mention shields being split or smashed or otherwise destroyed to the point where they had to be discarded, which is not a problem, especially in a judicial duel like the Holmgang, where you would even get multiple shields to begin with because the expectation was that shields will be destroyed. If you wanted to maintain a fairly tight, cohesive formation, you might want a more durable shield, because even though you could pick up fallen shields, having a shield destroyed leads to an immediate gap in the formation. Now, of course, warriors being knocked down or killed leads to the same. It also produces a gap in the formation and it needs to be plugged, right? It's just another thing that can go wrong if you have a more durable shield that lasts longer. I would guess that on average, that particular formation is going to do better. Whereas in a duel, this is fantastic because you can actually make the opponent's blade get stuck in your shield deliberately by blocking with the rim of the shield rather than with a flat. So you can essentially decide what you want. Do you want to try to deflect it? So do you want to try to get it on the flat and then maybe push it aside? Or do you want to catch it right on the rim where it's most likely going to get stuck, and then you can finish them off before they're able to withdraw their weapon. Now, to be fair, depending on how they're made, they can withstand a bit more potentially. There is a video in which a reconstruction of an original shield is being tested that was covered in leather. Quite often this type of shield, the surviving ones at least, are found to have been covered in animal hide, either tanned or untanned. And that gives it additional strength. Check out that video, by the way. It's a very interesting test. I'll link it down below. I find it a little strange that the Romans went for a center grip shield for their particular use. In case of the Celts, I understand a little bit more because it's also similar to the Vikings. There's more emphasis on individual warriors. Whereas Romans, why choose a center grip shield? Why not a strapped one or Argive grip style? In my mind, the center grip shield is better for dueling and small scale melees because you have much more agility. There are more things you can do, more different techniques, if you will. You can choose whether you want to use the rim or the flat, whether you want to actively displace and intercept, and you can move it to different openings, etc., etc. And that makes a lot of sense. In particular, this round shield here is really a pretty good size overall. Like, it doesn't cover everything. Like, it doesn't really cover most of your legs. And legs were often a target. But that's more of a problem on a battlefield where you do see a lot of leg injuries. In a duel, or in general where you have enough space, it's less of a problem because what's the better response when somebody targets your leg? Move that sucker out of the way. Just step back with it. Again, in a tight formation, you can't do that. But if you have the space, then that's a better way to defend your legs. So you don't need a shield that's that large. It covers your entire body. The drawback is that holding it by a center grip, depending on the size and weight of the shield, can be pretty tiring. If you're strong and have plenty of endurance, it's not necessarily a problem until it becomes one because you've been fighting for who knows how long. Eventually you will get tired. That's true for anything, even with the lightest, even with a buckler. Eventually you'll get tired if you fight for long enough. But it would happen a lot sooner with this kind of shield. Which makes me wonder if they might have rested the shield on the ground when possible. Like dueling shields that you see in late medieval manuscripts, where they just put it down and fight around it. That would definitely be easier. I don't know. I'm not sure there are any sources on that. Moving on to strapped shield. So the advantage here is that you don't have to hold it straight out in front of you. You can keep your arm bent, and keep it closer to your body. Because the closer it is to your body, the less leverage acts on your arm. If you hold it out, it's a long lever, so the force of gravity is amplified by the lever. Whereas if you keep it nice and close, it's easier to hold. And especially if you have a guige strap, it just hangs there, taking off a lot of the weight. And yeah, this is quite comfortable. You can stand like this for a long time and no problem. It's way easier. The downside of that is, of course, especially with a guige strap, you can't move it as much. Like it's just tethered. But even without, like it's a little bit more limited how well you can move it around because your arm is fixed in a certain position. When fighting in a fairly tight formation, you're limited in what you can do. You don't have all the space that you have in a one-on-one duel. You can't be using footwork freely and you're just much more restricted. It makes sense to have a shield like this that takes some of the weight off, that's pretty stable, that can't be rotated as much, like a revolving door the way a center grip shield is. And you can stand pretty close together and you can strike over top of the shield or thrust or whatever, and it's going to be, in my opinion, more effective for large-scale battlefield use. In that sense, I'm thinking a kite shield may very well be the closest you can get to the best shield for battlefield use. Strapped, so it has the aforementioned advantages, and it's large. This is a heater shield, much smaller. In general, you can see shields getting smaller as you get more armor. But if we just look at the shield design in and of itself, independent of armor, which of course is an unrealistic abstraction because armor is part of the equation, you can't just ignore it. But if we did, then in my opinion, a kite shield would do quite well. because you can cover even your legs fairly well with it without needing footwork to evade, which once again in a tight formation you can't do. For dueling, I think it's pretty difficult to decide which would be the best. Possibly. You have so many different designs that all have similar advantages, being more portable, more maneuverable, less tiring, quicker to use, etc., etc. This is one that stands out to me, the Chinese Gou-Rang from the Han Dynasty. Made a video about that if you haven't seen it, link down below. This is quite good because it is very light and quick to move around, but it still covers a good amount. Like the actual shield size itself, this would be quite a small buckler. But then you've got these hooks, which add a lot. Like on the battlefield, yeah, I wouldn't want to face arrows with this. Although with sufficient armor, it would arguably be fine. But this is a really good, efficient design. So just by angling it like this, I'm basically covering almost my entire left side. In fact, I could pull it a little bit lower, and now I've got everything covered up to about my hip. And if the opponent attempts a feint, this is pretty quick to move around and cover your different openings. There's so many different forms of buckler which fulfill the same purpose. And then you have a variety of different hide shields, which would also be quite useful in dueling and smaller melees, because due to the material, they're also fairly light and they can get weapons stuck. And they, at the same time, can still cover quite a lot of the body. If you look at plenty of Zulu shields, for example, they can protect most of the body while still being quite maneuverable. Generally, when designing a shield, you need to decide on some kind of balance between protection and ease of use. I don't think it's really possible to say which individual shield design is the best in total, because we always need to think about the best for what. What kind of situation are we talking about? Because civilian self-defense is a completely different scenario than a field battle. Anyway, this was pretty long, colored by my personal, experience and opinions and all that. But I hope you found it interesting, entertaining anyway. Thanks for watching, and take care, folks.